A not so funny thing happened on the way to this sermon. While this is the day for springing forth, I will admit that this may be the fate of this sermon, that it will have more bouncing around than I will. Because a month ago, as we were planning these services, my thought was to center the ways that over the last years, as the world has become more and more complex and harder to hold, that we have been seduced into taking refuge into personal consumption, adding to an economy that is gradually consolidating power in fewer and fewer uber-wealthy hands. I thought that would be worth paying attention to, the way that that happens and making us more attentive to what we can buy than what we can be. Sometimes it feels like the world drives us that way. I thought I would talk about how we have widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots and concentrated wealth in the hands of a very few while reducing our actual interactions with one another over these last 2 years, especially taking away our feeling that we can interact in areas that are demanding or challenging, which require us not to live together into easy answers, but to find the answers together through our shared experience. Yet in these last 2 weeks, what has been filling my heart and my mind and my spirit were the images and stories from Ukraine about people who were living one life one day and then woke up to find themselves living a totally different life. People who we hear on our radio each morning who were tech workers and nurses, teachers and scientists, people we might have chatted with in an international experience in a cafe at one time. These people are, in a flash, living without what's needed to live, and a growing number losing life itself. I think all of us have been holding the brutal and abrupt ways that lives were interrupted, that families were disassembled, that people have been killed. Not just Ukrainians, but Russians as well. And while 8 years of Russian military action around and within their nation might have made this in some sense predictable, I think we, who sat and watched for about the same time period, the rising of hate and signs of hate in our own nation, did not understand that that meant that we could elect an autocrat. We understand at a deep level how we can be surprised somehow in this way, because we really don't believe that this could happen in these times to us. We understand that, and we're holding that with the people of Ukraine and the Russians too, who are rebelling and increasingly paying the price. I found in myself, and perhaps you have it too, a nagging, painful deja vu, and it was interfering with my ability to be present to the situation in Ukraine. Once I acknowledged that, though, I began diving deeper, and I will tell you, I have watched hours and hours and hours of interviews with Masha Gessen, the Russian-American journalist, author, translator, and activist who has studied Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin for many years. Gessen's research shows that Putin believes he can return to another time, the kind of blatant imperialism of not just a few decades ago, but of several centuries ago, when conquering was the game of powerful men. In an interview with the New York Times, this is Ezra Klein this week, Gessen, who uses they-them pronouns, said, Putin appears to be placing himself on a continuum of Russian history that he sees as a series of great leaders beginning with Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was not an emperor that Russians particularly revered before Putin's reign, but the first monument to Ivan the Terrible went up 6 or 7 years ago in Russia. Gessen says, so Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Putin. It's a huge span. It's a series, they say, of great, brutal, expansionist dictators. In another interview with Democracy Now!, they say that Putin lives so completely within his own isolated vision that his interactions with people, or even with nations, are just basically transactions that serve to answer his greater ends. This move, from the relational to the transactional, is one of the many things that we've also experienced. It was one of the things I was going to talk about in that other sermon that I was going to preach, on a smaller personal scale. As someone who worked and drove and went out in the world in 2020 and 2021, almost every day, sometimes it seemed as if I'd been reborn into this bizarre world in which the only creatures that existed were me, my car, and a lot of Amazon Sprinter vans, which gradually became the larger delivery vans, which I've learned are called Utilimasters, which we now see all the time. We replaced so many of our human interactions with purchases, and while many of us spent less during the pandemic times, those purchases took up more and more space in our lives. Binge watching Netflix or PBS, the latest video games or eating or shopping, all of these were distractions from the real fears of the world. In moderation, not bad, and yet in excess, they may corrode our sense of our common purpose, or even our connections to our own individual higher values and callings. And some of us also had drinks and drugs and unhealthy relationships with food and other addictions to fill the gaps. What we began to keep at arm's length was each other and the larger world. I've talked to more than one person in the last couple months who have said that the lesson of the last half decade for them is that good will not triumph over evil, and so we might as well just consume for ourselves and have a good time. I think I still believe that parts of that other sermon are still important. Because if we look at the growth of hypercapitalism, we see that it's at the cost of our planet, but also it's at the cost of our sense of greater purpose. And that brings me to the other part of what I saw in my heart when I began to pay attention to what was happening in Ukraine. Because it's a terrible thing that's happening, but what we are also seeing is the spirit of a people who are living out to defend their highest values. They are taking up the cause of defending their nation, as many as they can. And I think that's something that we all need to think about, that we cannot just give up all of our highest aspirations and simply become the pawns of oligarchs and the uber wealthy. How has the despair of the last years poked little holes into our stores of faith and vision? How does the coverage of Ukraine, where tragedy and personal heroics are reported each day, give us a little to despair at and a lot to hope for as well? They are deeply inspiring. So last night we sprang forward. This is always one of the hardest weekends if you work on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings. This year I will tell you that I actually saw the time change. I actually was looking at my computer when it went from 2 to 3 a.m. I was up futzing with this bouncing sermon in this bouncing time. At 3:45, a BBC update came across my phone saying that 35 were believed dead in the latest attack in Ukraine, and I realized how hard it was for me to comprehend this loss of life. In this age of digital information, we can know about almost every death in this time of war, and yet it is hard for us to even hold a single death, the loss of that infinite possibility that has been lost and snuffed out. The oligarchs terrorizing Ukraine and the uber-wealthy who are leading a charge against poor, black, trans people in our nation, to name many, have a common methodology. Each takes something of great value that is not in itself evil, the desire to have comfort or a national pride, and twists it into a grotesque caricature and manifestation of excess. Perhaps Putin is trying to reestablish the 1850s, and our last president was trying to reestablish the 1950s. Though their wealth might make them feel that they have superpowers. Their kryptonite is anything that recognizes the worth and dignity of people and which challenges their deplorable transactional embrace of people around them. In the face of what we lost these last years, our belief in a more triumphant view of humanity, perhaps, time, so many lives, in the face of the instant losses of safety, shelter, and life itself for the people of Ukraine, how can we not keep working for a world of more equity? Hearing the stories of those who long for nothing more than the routines of work and play, family and nourishment that were theirs a month ago, how can we not live each and every one of our days infused with gratitude? Quaker teacher Parker Palmer posted this week, "My heart is broken by what's happening in Ukraine, and I'm profoundly inspired by the people of that war-torn country. They are driven by a fierce love of life, their children's lives, their neighbors' lives, the life of their democracy. They make me wonder again about myself and my country. Do we love everyone's life enough to push back on evil for the sake of the common good? Or do we blink at the evil done to others as long as our personal lives are going okay?" Over these last years, many of us have found solace and comfort in good things as well. We've taken back up old hobbies, we've reconnected with old friends. And yet in this isolation, we have also perhaps sought comfort in a way of escaping from the world that we cannot afford to sustain. Almost certainly, we have disconnected from our many roles in the world and our belief that we can make a difference. And we need that back, my friends. We need to take that back. We can take the energy from meals with friends and enjoying this beautiful spring, which is springing out forward around us. This spring, which for us is not marred with shrapnel or bombs, and we can use it to make our days glad, and we can use it to support what we are passionate about: freedom, equity, and respect for the worth and dignity of people around the world. We can remember that ignoring signs of what is coming in the next election, etc., the next lawsuit, is at our own peril. We can do this through our special collection today by taking advantage of C.B. Beale, the queer activist who we are privileged to have with us this afternoon, by joining in a virtual walk to connect to people, by signing up to help our winter night family, by doing all we can. As I worked through the night last night, we can appreciate the turkey that is taking a solo across the front of the stage. As I worked through the night last night, what I began to realize was that the sermon that I needed to say was actually not that much different than the one I had planned to deliver back last month. We may not be dreaming of world domination, but in the back of our mind, we may no longer care as much about helping create justice because we know it's a longer path than we previously thought. And we may have griefs that we need to mourn together before we get re-engaged. What irreconcilable losses are we reminded of when we see the people of Ukraine trying to reach their neighbors in Russia who are drowning in a river of false news? When we watch one impossibly wealthy man impose his will on nations and break people's lives in his wake? What wreckage and carnage have we not yet been able to sift through because of the double whammy of political upheaval and pandemic? One thing I think that history will find when it looks back is that President Donald Trump was very successful, though much of his success was masked by the Trojan horse of buffoonery. He and the movement he inspired to be the leader of convinced so many of us that the things that we hold most dear are just foolish pipe dreams for those who live in the world of ideals. That embracing the fullness of our humanity and the breadth of the human family is divisive, and that our aspirations to create a common good are foolish, and that capitalism in all its forms is always good and should reign supreme. from further crippling our postal service to obliterating the charitable infrastructure of our shared aspirations, and instead inviting those lost and struggling to take up his mythical, self-made, and self-satisfied story, he accomplished a great deal, and it is ours to be the counter to that. Here are the things that I think we need to do. We need to pay attention. We need to be present to all the blessings in our lives and the simple pleasures, and show up as well and do what we can for the world that we dream of, that we are the stewards of. We need to take care of those who are most affected, and we need to remember that there are people doing the brave and courageous thing all around us every day. One of the last stories I saw in my deep dive into tragedy in the Ukraine was in the wee hours of this morning when I read a story about a 23-year-old Russian politics graduate who said that he was going to cross the border into Ukraine from Russia because, as he said, it is my responsibility to do anything I can to help Ukrainians. News sources say that over 200,000 people have fled Russia since this conflict began. We are more than what we can buy, and even more than what we can see our way out of. Maybe all these pieces we hold in tension, all this jumping about, has one message, that what we can do is to enlarge our hearts and minds and spirits to be part of the counter to the forces that will see us all to their demise. Today is a day for springing forth. Let us spring forth to hold the joy in this life, to keep moving towards the goal of beloved world community where peace and justice, respect and care is something that all will achieve. Let us be the ones to keep those drum beats going, and let us take those words from Tarana Burke. We'll take what we have, we'll make what we need. We are the ones who can help make it so.